New gardeners approach gardening from the point of view that they want perfect, pristine plants. Older gardeners come along and they see holes in leaves and rips and tears and things nibbling on them, and they just shrug their shoulders and say, it's no big deal. So the way you approach this is really important. But there's some general things that are worth understanding. The first one is that most bugs are good bugs. 8 or 9 out of 10 are good. We end up talking a lot about the bad ones because they're harming our plant. But there's all those other ones that are good. Anytime you do anything in the garden to harm bugs, you harm both the good and the bad. If you spray anything in the garden, you will harm both groups. I get a real chuckle when I see comments online saying, well, I sprayed so-and-so bug with this concoction and it didn't harm anything else. Well, you don't see those other bugs, but you're harming everything. Sprays harm everything. There are very few concoctions that are specific for one type of bug. So think about that. Every time we try to get rid of some bad ones, we're also getting rid of some good ones. Most problems in the garden are cultural. They're not pests and diseases. There are things that you're doing wrong, either with nutrients or watering or the amount of light you're giving plants or something like that. It's a cultural problem, and they're causing leaves. They're causing spotting, they're causing things that look like it might be bugs, but they're not. So whenever you see a problem in the garden, the first thing to think about is this a cultural problem? You also have to understand that bugs need to eat too, and we cannot live in this world without these bugs. They're extremely important for us. That's a whole other topic, but you have to allow bugs in the garden. I tend to grow the right plants. So if I find a plant that I always have problems with, I don't grow that plant. I try to grow something different where I have less problems, rather than fighting that bug. Having a variety in the garden helps, especially with pests. With lots of different things going on in a garden, pests do have trouble finding the plant that they really want. And some of these pests are pretty particularly, they only go on certain types of plants. Mix things up in the garden and have lots of variety. That helps. Make homes for things. Understand where your pest control lives. So for instance, a lot of people will build little homes for toads and snakes, because they like to have a cool place to hide out in. And toads are one of the greatest things to attack slugs. So find out what's eating your pests naturally and then try to make homes for them. And the last one is learn to live with some of the damage. Share the food with the rest of the world, the bug world that is. I always include this one just because it's a really cute little picture. This is a tree frog. Now he's hiding for the day and he thinks nobody can see him. I guess he can't tell that the flower is actually red. Tree frogs are kind of interesting. They hide out during the day, they come out at night and eat lots of bugs. But if we don't keep some weeds around, we don't have places for them to hide, they won't be in the garden and they won't help us take care of bugs. So here's one of the diseases that shows up all over the place. In fact, you'll get it all over your ornamental beds as well as some vegetables. But particularly the cucumber family is really prone to powdery mildew. Whenever I have a disease like this, what I like to do is try and understand the disease before I try to find a solution. Whereas I find most new gardeners, they just want a solution. So powdery mildew is actually many different diseases. Gardeners call them all powdery mildew, but there's thousands of different species of this. So the powdery mildew you get on your lilac bush will not infect your cucumbers. Those are different species. So you don't have to worry about this spreading throughout your whole vegetable garden. It doesn't affect tomatoes and beans. Beans a little bit. Doesn't affect peas, doesn't affect your beets. It's only on a few different crops, and quite honestly, the only place I get a lot of it is on my cucumbers. It is a fungal disease, and this is one case where there are some home remedies that do work. So you can use milk. I don't know how well this has been tested scientifically, but there's some non-scientific studies that show that it does work. So 40% milk, 60% water. It seems like milk with some fat in it works better, so try a 2% milk maybe. Mix it up, spray your plants. The one on the right has actually been tested and is known to work, and it's a baking soda solution. 1 tablespoon baking soda, 1 tablespoon vegetable oil or some type of mineral oil, and then 1 gallon of water. You make these up, shake them up, spray your plant. Now here's the trick to this. Neither one of these cures powdery mildew. What they do is they change the pH on the leaves so that the powdery mildew doesn't grow. So you can prevent growth, but you can't reverse the damage that's there, and you can't kill the growth that's there. So once a leaf is half white, it's going to stay half white even if you spray it. The trick with these is to spray it before you see any white spots on your leaf. These are one of the few home remedies I suggest people use because 99% of what you'll find online for home remedies simply does not work. But these two do. Septoria leaf spot is very common. This affects mostly tomatoes. It's a fungus again. It comes from the ground and comes through the air. So the spores are created and it flies around. But if you had it the previous year, there is a good chance that some of those spores will come up from the soil. And one way they do that is by us watering the soil. So the water comes down, hits the soil, splashes up, and in that water droplet are enough spores to contaminate your plants. You almost always see this disease starting at the bottom of the plant. It slowly works its way to the top. All right, so what do you do about it? There are a couple things you can do, but it's not a serious disease. So the one thing that helps is to mulch. If you don't get splashing from the soil onto your plants, you're less likely to get the disease, or at least you'll get less of it. So a mulch on the soil helps. Some people will remove the lower leaves early in the season because it's those lower leaves that tend to get the infection first. The reality is that in zone 5, this is not a particularly damaging disease. By the end of summer, your plants are going to look pretty crappy, but your tomatoes are all ripening and they will continue to ripen properly. So the disease doesn't harm the fruit. So for the most part, you can just ignore it and let it happen. And then in the fall, compost those leaves. Now, there's lots of controversy about whether you should compost diseased leaves. There are lots of people that say, hey, once a leaf is diseased like this, you should not compost it because those spores might come back out of the compost and infect your plants next year. And there is some validity to that argument. But the thing you need to understand is that by fall, there isn't a leaf in the garden that's not infected with something. Most leaves, in fact, now have various kinds of fungus and bacteria growing on them. And if we removed everything from the garden that was infected, we'd have no compost. Couldn't find any material to use. The reality is that Septoria leaf spot is there every year. I've been gardening for over 30 years. My tomatoes always have it every year, no matter what I've tried to do to get rid of it. So I just compost everything. I don't worry about it. Now, there is another disease that looks something like this, and it's a blight. And there's both an early blight and a late blight, and they're completely different. And this is a good example of why you need to know your diseases. An early blight doesn't harm the plant too much. It doesn't harm the fruit. So you can leave it on the plant and still get a good harvest. It does overwinter in the soil. So if you have it one year, there is a good chance you'll get it again. So hygiene in that spot can be beneficial for early blight. Now, late blight, it looks different, but it's really deadly. When it hits your plants, within about a week, the whole plant is dead. It also affects the fruit, and the fruit is damaged to the point you can't eat it. Now, that blight doesn't overwinter in cold climates. It has to be brought in from outside, and the spores from that can travel something like 50 miles. So normally we don't get late blight in the northeast US, but we have had it in a few years, and it's always come in with seedlings that are grown in some sort of nursery farther south. And then they slowly come up, they get distributed throughout northern Ontario, and then everybody gets the disease. Not much you can do about it, except there are some cultivars now that are resistant to late blight. They're just starting to come on the market. Most of the tomatoes you buy are not resistant. Here's another very common problem. Blossom end rot. Usually happens on the first tomatoes that are growing. You know, you've got your first tomato, it's starting to get a good size. It maybe even is getting a little red on the sides. And you're thinking, boy, I can hardly wait to eat this. And then the whole end goes black like this. And that's blossom end rot. This is a cultural problem. Plants get it because they're not watered on a regular basis. They either get too much water, too little water, or it cycles back and forth. They're really dry for a week, and then it rains really heavily, and they get too much water, and then you get blossom end rot. Now, it used to be thought that calcium was involved in this, but the latest research shows that the calcium levels in the fruit do go down, but only after the fruit is infected. So the problem is causing low calcium. It's not that low calcium is causing the problem. So if you go online and ask about blossom end rot, you'll get all kinds of solutions for this problem. Add more calcium to the soil. Some people plant their tomatoes with the tums underneath. The amount of calcium in a Tums is so small it makes no difference. And it's not a calcium problem. Lots of people use Epsom salt. Well, Epsom salt is magnesium. It's not calcium. So there's no way that's going to control the problem. And in fact, if you put too much magnesium in your soil, it actually ties up the calcium so your plant has less calcium. This is a cultural problem. You have to water your plants more evenly, and then you don't get blossom end rot. I rarely get this disease. Now I mulch, and that mulch helps keep the soil evenly wet. Last year I tried growing some of these in a straw bale, and there's something called straw bale gardening. I won't go into that. You can come to my blog and read about it if you want. It doesn't really work well in colder climates. But because the watering is so much more difficult in a straw bale, those tomatoes actually did get blossom end rot. Even though in my garden I never see the problem when I grow in the soil. Here's another big problem, slugs and snails. And slugs and snails are essentially the same thing, but there's lots of different species. The one on the right there is a banana slug. They're really large and kind of gross looking. There's many home remedies for this, and none of them work really well. Eggshells don't work at all. Coffee grounds don't work at all. Diatomaceous earth will work as long as it's dry, but as soon as you put it on the ground, it gets wet and then it doesn't work. You can put little cups of beer in the ground, and that does work a little bit. You will find some dead slugs in the morning, but most of them are just sleeping off their hangover. It's not very effective. Spraying ammonia, well, if you spray a slug with ammonia, it will kill it, but spraying it on your plants or on the soil is useless. It just evaporates. So most of these home remedies, they just simply don't work. Again, if you want to read about those, I've written about pretty much all of those in my blog. The best thing for slugs is two approaches. To get rid of them quick, get yourself some slug bait. They're really safe chemicals. The other alternative is to use natural means. There's lots of things that eat slugs. I mentioned the toads and the snakes, but the small snails and snail eggs, they're eaten by all kinds of beetles. So by keeping more garbage, more organic matter on the soil, you'll attract those beetles. And those beetles actually take care of your slug problem. The other thing that you have to understand about slugs is that their preferred meal is rotting vegetation. They want dead plants. So if you clean your gardens up really thoroughly, they have nothing to eat. So then they go after your good plant. But they'd actually prefer you leaving some stuff on the ground to rot for them. That's their favorite food. Cabbage butterflies are also a big problem. If you grow cabbages, you're going to have these. They're those nice little white butterflies that are going around. They lay eggs on the cabbages. Little caterpillars come out, they decimate your cabbages, and you're not very happy. Again, you could spray for these, you can do a variety of different things, but there's actually a fairly simple cultural technique you can use, and that's row covers. Any kind of pest that flies to your crop and lays eggs can be stopped very easily with these row covers. So you put them on in the spring, you leave them on during early summer because that's when these butterflies are flying around looking for a place to lay their eggs. And then once they're finished their egg laying, you can take these off. And this works really well for a lot of pests, and it's very easy to do. Here's another one that's kind of ugly. It's the leaf miner, and it tends to affect things like spinach and beet greens. So when people grow beets, some people grow them for the root at the bottom. Other people grow them for the leaves at the top. Trying to harvest both of those doesn't work very well because you're taking off the young beet leaves. It never makes a root. So you have to kind of choose one or the other. But both of these get something called leaf miner. And this is actually a little fly, and it comes along and lays little eggs, and the eggs hatch out in little caterpillars, or properly called larvae, and the larvae live inside the leaf, kind of between the outer layer, the top layer and the bottom layer, and they eat away the plant inside that leaf, and that's why you get these white areas. And once it's in there, you're not going to want to eat these leaves. The best thing to stop these again is row covers, because the flies have to come and lay their eggs. Now if you're only interested in the beet root, so you're going to harvest the bottom part, these aren't really a big problem. So I have them a little bit every year on my beets, and they do disfigure the leaves, but not to the point where the beet root doesn't grow properly. So I don't worry about it. But if I was harvesting the leaves as a vegetable, I'd have to do something, because I sure wouldn't want that in my salad. Cucumber beetles are very popular. Well, they're not very popular, but they're very common in the garden. And there's two types. There's the spotted kind and there's the striped kind. And they're actually quite small insects. So a lot of people see damage on their cucumbers and their melons, and they're not sure why they have this problem because they don't really notice the insects. You have to get real close and see them, and then you'll notice them and they'll just chew away at everything. They don't do a tremendous amount of harm if you don't have too many of them. You'll still get cucumbers off your plants. They don't actually harm the fruit itself, but they do go after the leaves, make holes in them. They'll go after the flowers. And again, they're fairly easy to control with row covers. Here's a really ugly caterpillar, but you really don't want to kill this one. This is called the hornworm, and it goes on tomatoes. And some years I see it, other years I don't. And usually by the time I see it, I notice that half a plant is all eaten up. These guys are big, and they eat a lot of that leaf material. You could take these off your plants, and if you put them somewhere else on the ground, they'd probably be eaten by birds, or they'll just die, because they're fairly fussy about what they eat. But you might want to keep them around. Now, this is the same kind of caterpillar, but it's now covered with cocoons. What happens here is that there's a very tiny wasp, and we have lots of predatory wasps. They won't sting you, so most wasps are actually good guys in the garden. But they will go after these caterpillars, and they lay their eggs on the skin. They have their own little larvae. That larvae hatches out, goes inside the caterpillar, lives in there for a while. Then they pupate, and these are the white pupa that are sitting on top of the caterpillar. It's not dead yet, but it's also not moving. And then the wasp hatches out. So if we remove all of these from our garden, that predatory wasp has no place to lay its egg, and so it leaves the garden. So it's a good idea to leave these guys. And in fact, what some people will do is they will grow an extra tomato plant or two and use them as sacrificial plants. So when they find one of these caterpillars, they'll put it on this sacrificial plant that they don't care about and let the wasp come and take care of the problem. And if the wasps don't come, you end up with a really nice moth. It's a huge moth. It's really special. You don't see them very often, but this is a way that you still keep your crop, and you take the pest from that, put it on this sacrificial plant that you don't care about, and you're not harming nature. Remember, it's important that all of these bugs live somewhere. They all have to eat something. Another way to get rid of pests is something called companion planting. And you can find whole books on this subject. And you will find that 99.9% of gardeners believe in companion planting. About 45 years ago, some people wrote some books about companion planting. They said that, basil grows well with tomatoes, and if you grow those two plants together, both plants grow better. And they came up with long lists of all these combination of plants that you should use together. And when you do that, you have less pests. Well, it turns out that most of that information is complete fiction. I've spent quite a bit of time over the last year trying to find cases where this actually works. And there are actually very few of them. Many of these stories have been around for a long time, but they're not based on any kind of fact. The one example that I have found that works is garlic and onion. If you grow those with certain types of vegetables, they do ward off some kinds of pests. And the reason is that garlic and onions have a lot of sulfur in them, and they have a lot of compounds that both are smelly. That's why we like those two vegetables. And they don't taste good. So it tends to keep pests away. But there's lots of others that don't work. So marigolds are recommended by everyone. Put marigolds around your garden and the smell from the marigolds will keep pests away. Well, that really doesn't work. And in fact, the marigolds attract all kinds of insects to the garden. If you grow those around your garden, you're almost certainly to have thrifts in the garden, which is a tiny little insect. If you put the marigolds somewhere else, then your garden is a good chance they won't have thrips. So don't believe most of the companion planting. There are probably some good cases where it works, but 99% of it doesn't work.